Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an interview with a guest or multiple guests or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's particular episode, I'm unpacking the paper titled Teachers' Views and Experiences on Teaching Second and Subsequent Programming Languages. And this paper was written by Ethel Tshukudu, Quentin Cutts, Olivier Goletti, Aladin Swidan, and Felina Hermans. Apologies if I mispronounce any names. I do look up names before I pronounce them, but there are often many different ways to pronounce different names, depending on the different origin. All right, so here's the abstract for this particular paper, and there are like little subheaders in here for motivation, objectives, method, results, and discussion. All right, quote, motivation. More and more high schools are teaching programming, and in many cases, teachers teach multiple programming languages to the same group of students. Objectives. The goal of this paper is to explore the views of high school teachers on second and subsequent programming languages, including their motivation for teaching multiple languages, their struggles, and their use of transfer strategies when they teach their second or third programming language. Method. The study consists of semi-structured interviews with 23 high school teachers in 2 European countries. Results. Our findings indicate that school pupils face the same issues as university students when moving from first to subsequent languages. Furthermore, the teachers' attitudes towards second language learning are highly variable, both positive and negative, with some supportive teaching strategies used, but many less helpful ones in evidence to. Discussion. Our findings suggest that the value of second language learning needs to be highlighted in teacher professional development materials more strongly, and that teachers might need more support in implementing transfer strategies, end quote. All right, if I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I'd actually pull a quote from page 297, which says that this paper seeks to, quote, understand computing teachers' views and practices on the use of transfer strategies in teaching second and subsequent programming languages. End quote. I think the abstract does a very nice job of kind of summarizing it, but that's my one sentence summary of this particular paper, which I do highly recommend reading. As always, you can find a link to this particular paper and some other resources related to computer science education at jaredoleary.com, or by simply clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on in the description. And when you do that, you'll notice that this podcast is powered by BootUp, which is the nonprofit that I work for, which provides elementary computer science professional development to school districts, as well as free Scratch Junior and Scratch curricula that I create. So make sure you check it out if you haven't done so already at bootuppd.org. All right, so in the introduction of this paper, they mentioned that university programs will teach many different languages in a computer science program. So you might learn object-oriented, you might learn some system-level stuff like C, you might learn something functional like Scheme, as well as domain-specific languages like SQL, which is SQL, and then HTML, which is hypertext markup language, etc. So if we are going to be teaching many different languages in a university level, okay, we need to be able to figure out how to transfer the understandings from one language to another. But the same thing applies to the K-12 context. So if you're going to be teaching multiple different languages, like let's say Scratch, and then maybe eventually like Swift or Ruby or JavaScript or whatever, then it's helpful to consider how to transfer understandings, like the concepts and practices, from one language into another. So in the introduction, the authors briefly cite some positive and negative transfers between languages for university students in particular. And then they note that when educators actually focus on the transfer, then it actually can help improve student learning. And I'm glossing over this really quick because they actually do talk about this in the background section in section 2. So I'll talk about it a little bit more in a second. But they close out the introduction with their 4 research questions, which are on page 295, and they are, why do teachers teach a second programming language? Second one is, what kinds of benefits or problems do teachers notice when teaching second or subsequent programming languages? Third one is, what are the views of computing teachers on the use of transfer strategies? And then the fourth one is, what types of transfer strategies do computing teachers use? All right, so in the background, they provide a discussion on some prior scholarship related to learning multiple programming languages. Again, most of these are in the university setting. So they point out in 2.1 that there's different research on different programming languages. So if you're interested in a specific one, you can check that out. Sometimes they'll compare 2 different languages. In 2.2, the authors discuss some issues with syntax in programming education, which in my experience, working with K-8 students in multiple programming languages, I agree that syntax is tricky. And then in my own programming experience, I would frequently mix up oh wait, how would I write this in this language or this other language? And I'd create little syntax errors. But I mean, honestly, that's to be expected. Once you get into a habit of typing something in one way, then all of a sudden you have to type the same concept in a different way. It's going to take some getting used to be able to jump back and forth between the two. But interestingly, the authors actually cite a paper that Andreas Stefik did, who was a guest on this particular show many episodes ago. Highly recommend listening to his interview. But in that interview, he actually mentions this paper where he did a placebo language. So it's random language in terms of just random characters assigned to different concepts, and then compared it with programming languages like Java and Perl, and I actually found that common programming languages ended up scoring worse than just like randomly assigned languages, the placebo languages, which is fascinating. So I highly recommend listening to that particular interview, not only for that, but also for like our discussions on accessibility and disability in CS education. So I'll include a link to that in the show notes. All right, in 2.3, the authors mentioned that there is research on transfer between different programming languages. So for example, transferring from like a block-based language to a text-based language. Some will also look at text-based to text-based that have like similar syntax. And with any of these transfers, there are some benefits, but there are also some negative transfer effects that occur. So if you want to check out the scholarship that is summarized in that, make sure you check out 2.3. And then 2.4 is probably the section that I think most educators, whether you're in K-12 or higher education, should take a look at. So this is on some of the known transfer strategies. And so some of the methods might include like actually identifying and activating prior knowledge. So like saying, hey, here are the concepts and practices that you learned previously, and here's how they are similar to what we are learning now in terms of syntax. Like it's the same concept, just basically phrased a little bit differently. They also provide some citations to studies that look at the context of transfer, as well as like self-regulation strategies, and then some of the benefits of like teaching concepts as an abstraction rather than just a rote skill. So for example, one approach known as bridging, where you try and make connections between the initial learning in like a programming language and then the new domain in which you're applying that learning. In my own practice, that was something that I used frequently, like with kids who would get stuck on something, like if they went from scratch and then all of a sudden they're learning JavaScript, it might be like, oh, I don't know how to do this if-else statement. And I'd be like, okay, think about how you would have done this in Scratch and try and think of some of the things that you've been learning in the JavaScript content you've been going through and try and imagine those connections between one language and the next. And sometimes I honestly didn't even have to say anything. Like students would just make those connections and I'd be like, how did you learn how to do that thing that you've got in your code? Because like having gone through all the courses that they're going through or all the resources they're going through, I found it really interesting when students like jumped outside of the box and I saw that they did something that wasn't explicitly taught or demonstrated or modeled in the code that they were working on or learning from. And so I'd get excited and be like, hey, how did you learn how to do like that for loop or something? And be like, oh, well, I thought about how I would do it in this other language. And then I just applied that into this particular language, which was awesome. It's just transfer based off of reflecting on prior understandings in relation to what they were trying to do in the new language. But you can certainly be more explicit with it if you're teaching the language. And I would do both in the classroom. But again, if you're interested, I highly recommend checking out this background information. Like each one of these, I just very quickly summarize the research, but there's many citations throughout. So you can check out those papers that are associated with those sections. All right, so section 3 is on the research setup. And so we have participants. There were 23 K-12 educators. These were in 2 different European countries, in the Netherlands and Scotland. They had a range of experience from 5 years to 35 years teaching computing. They all taught at the secondary levels or high schools, but some of them had some responsibilities like in the last year of primary school. So they worked with ages 11 through 18-year-olds. And then in these 2 contexts in Scotland, there was a national CS curriculum that was used that the teachers would follow. But then in the Netherlands, it was much more flexible than that. So they were able to kind of come up with their own curriculum and content, as well as how to evaluate students. So authors did semi-structured interviews, and then they coded it using a thematic analysis, which just basically means they went through, they read like each line or each paragraph, and then would kind of assign a code to it to say like, hey, this particular thing talked about student motivation. And then this other sentence or paragraph talked about negative transfer effects, etc. By the way, I'm just like making up codes on the fly. They didn't actually list out what each one of their codes were. So just trying to clarify in case you don't have a background in research. It doesn't mean they like went and typed out like C++ kind of code. It was like coming up with basically an abstraction of a selection of discourse. All right, so let's get into the results, which is really interesting. So research question 1 is on the reasons for having multiple languages. So table 2 on page 299 provides a really quick summary of this. So the first one is that 7 of the teachers indicated that it was part of the curriculum, so they basically had to do it. But then 13 teachers said that they preferred to start with a simple language, so like something block-based maybe, and then move on to a different language and dive deeper into that. Now within this category, they had different subcategories of this. So 8 of the teachers said the reason why they went with the simple language first is because it was more engaging for students. 5 of the teachers said that it helps to like limit the number of errors and like frustration and whatnot. So for example, when using blocks, you don't have to worry about putting a semicolon at the end of things or where your brackets start and end, etc. So that can make it a whole lot easier to avoid different errors, which can help with building confidence, which is what 4 teachers indicated was a rationale for doing a simple language. And then 3 of the teachers indicated that it helps them to be able to focus on concepts. So rather than teaching the skill of writing out lines of code, whether it's blocks or text, in a simple language, they would teach the concepts. So maybe thinking of like teaching the pseudocode or the ideas behind what you would eventually write, and focusing on that, and the end product is not as important as understanding the concepts behind the code that is eventually written. Now, this is important, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later in my rant at the end of these solo episodes that I always do when I talk about some lingering questions and thoughts. Now, the third main category for this is that some teachers chose to do this, 10 of them, because it had different benefits from learning different languages. So for example, 4 of the teachers said that each language has different applications, such as a language, being better for understanding hardware, or a language being better for programming games, or like in my case, a language like Ruby being better for programming music through something like Sonic Pi, etc. And then 6 teachers said that there's a benefit for knowing different languages because it just gives you a different perspective on understanding the concept or just coding in general. So for example, understanding how to use if-else statements versus case switch statements in different languages might help understand the concept of conditionals and go, oh, there are different types of conditionals that I can use in different contexts with different languages, etc. All right, so research question 2, problems and benefits of teaching multiple languages. Table 3 is an excellent summary of this. This is from page 300. All right, so let's start with the benefits of teaching transfer. So 15 teachers found a positive effect on understanding programming concepts in the second language. Some teachers noted that there's transfer of understanding from the first language to the second, or that students were able to make connections to the previous language. And a small number noted that this only happened under very specific conditions. So for example, maybe they would make the connection between conditionals, but not necessarily the connections between different loops, statements, and other control structures. The next main category of benefits was a positive effect on cognitive abilities. So 7 teachers indicated this. So for example, transfer problem-solving skills and abstract thinking, as well as just like broadening student perspectives. Now I'm going through this very quickly. I do highly recommend actually reading through the paper, and you can see more of an explanation with more examples of each one of these. Again, you can find a link to this in the show notes. And now let's talk about some of the problems that were found in this. So there are 4 different problems. So 8 teachers noted a negative effect on syntax transfer. So if you're not very familiar with syntax differences, like for example in Scratch, you can drag and drop things. You don't have to worry about adding in a semicolon. It's very easy to see where your brackets basically open and close in terms of like the if blocks. You can see what's housed inside of that by simply seeing what it's basically hugging. But if you go into a language like, JavaScript, you have to actually see where your curly brackets start and end, and you have to use semicolons, etc. At least you did last time I used it. Maybe there's an update or something that I'm not aware of. And if you learned a language where semicolons weren't a thing that you had to worry about, then yeah, there's going to be some transfer errors in terms of syntax. So you might forget to put a semicolon when maybe you've gone weeks, months, or even years not needing it, which I'll talk about more towards the end. All right, so within this particular category, there were some subcategories. So some teachers noted that the context switching is difficult and it takes time. And then other teachers mentioned that, well, there are issues with like mixing up the different syntaxes for different languages. And so when I was teaching several languages in the same space, like students were able to work on either Scratch, on Swift with Xcode, or on Ruby and Sonic Pi, or on JavaScript with Khan Academy. Like going from one computer to the next, I would sometimes make a mistake where I'd be like helping out one kid with JavaScript and then jump over to the next computer and help out another kid with Ruby. And I'd start explaining something that they would write out in JavaScript and then go, wait a minute, that's not how you do it with Ruby. So I would make these little syntactic mistakes when jumping back and forth between 2 different languages within the same space. And the same thing when I was learning different programming languages. It's to be expected. The next main category of problems is that there's a negative effect of semantic transfer. So the transfer of understanding or meaning. And 10 teachers noted that. So for example, there were misconceptions. Some students would make assumptions based on the semantics or just struggle with the semantics in general, which to me leads me to believe that they actually don't understand the concept itself behind the skills that they were developing when programming in the first language. But that's just a guess. The third category for problems is that students make no connection to or with the previous language. And so 4 teachers mentioned this, which is interesting. I'm curious what kind of pedagogies they used and whether they even asked for explicit connections. Because like I mentioned earlier, if a student was stuck on something, I'd be like, well, how would you do this in the other language that you were learning previously? And then often that would just kind of lead to the end result that they were hoping for. And if not, then we just kind of like talk through, oh, well, here's where you can go to learn more about that. Or let me connect you with somebody who can help explain that, whether it's a peer or myself. And the last category that 3 teachers mentioned is that students were demotivated or less confident to learn the new language. So for example, students would make generalizations on just like their lack of ability based on like their previous bad experience, or they just want to stick with the first language that they knew. Which is why for myself, I made the languages that kids could pick completely optional. So they could stick with one all year, or they could switch to multiple languages throughout the semester or year. At the start of the year, I'd have them spend a day on each one of the languages to see like the different platforms and what they could do with it. Like, hey, if you really want to make some music, check out Sonic Pi. If you want to make some art and animation, check out JavaScript in Khan Academy. If you want to make some app, do some Swift. And then if you want to make some games and stories, maybe check out Scratch. And so it was their interests that were guiding the selection of the language in terms of the things they wanted to be able to create or do, rather than me saying, hey, you have to learn this thing, and then we're going to learn this other thing, whether you want to or not. So that's a very different approach, and it'll have a profound impact on whether or not somebody wants to do that. Like for myself, I'd be happy to learn a language that allows me to create video games or music. But I'm less interested in languages like SQL, which I have spent some time learning a little bit of. And I was like, this doesn't really apply to what I'm interested in. Same thing can apply to students. Some students might really want to learn SQL, and then they might not like learning things I'm interested in, like gaming and music and whatnot. All right, so the next section is research question 3, which is the views on the use of transfer strategies, and then research question 4, which is on types of transfer strategies. So there's actually 2 tables on page 302, table 4 and table 5, that kind of discuss each of these. And again, the actual paper subsection discusses each one of these in more detail, but I'm just kind of giving you a broad overview of some of the findings. All right, so for views of transfer strategies, 12 of the teachers believe that they do not have to actually implement transfer strategies. 2 of them specifically said that transfer strategies can confuse students. 4 of them suggest there is not enough time to implement transfer strategies. 2 of them suggest that mapping prior language to a new language is difficult. 2 of them say that they can assume that students will transfer the understandings implicitly. And then 2 of them indicate that implementing different transfer strategies can put off students. Now, those are some really interesting findings. So more than half the teachers don't think you actually need to implement different transfer strategies. We also have 9 teachers who believe that knowledge of more than one language can help in the transfer, and then 4 teachers who believe that students don't have a strong understanding of the first language for any benefits to really carry over into the new language, which is also an interesting finding. I would argue that depends on how much time you spend on it. So if you spend a day on one language, like a simple language, and then go into a new language, yeah, you're probably right. But if you spend a month, a semester, a year or 2, I would disagree. So my guess is that has to do with how you implement it, how much time you spend on it in the context and whatnot. All right, so of the teachers who actually did use some transfer strategies, here are the findings for that. So some of the teachers explicitly referred to the first programming languages when teaching the second one. So like 6 of them specifically did that. 5 of them compared code between the 2 different programming languages, and then 4 teachers discussed the similarities of the different languages. The next category for the types of strategies was around favoring transition. So 8 teachers would focus on the concepts and emphasize those over anything else. So the syntax kind of became the afterthought. It was really thinking about, well, what is the meaning of a conditional? When would you use a conditional and why? Or when would you use different types of control structures and why? And then you can actually get into, okay, well, in this language, you'd write it this way. In this other language, you write it this other way. 4 teachers preferred to use some kind of a visual representation. 3 teachers would use some kind of a dedicated activity specific to that transition from one language to the next. And then 1 teacher mentioned actually avoiding any language-specific constructs. So again, focusing mainly on the concepts and not necessarily talking about what was specific to that language or the next language. And my guess is that teachers spent a limited amount of time on the first language, because that would kind of be hard to do if you're spending like a year or 2 learning a language to not actually get into some of the language-specific constructs. Now, the last category within the section is on preparing for transfer. So 3 of the teachers mentioned that they referred to everyday life. So my guess is that it has to do with like focusing on the concepts again. And then 1 teacher actually mentioned referencing the first programming language in some way. in terms of preparing students to learn a second language. Now, all of these are some excellent strategies that you can use for transfer of understanding. It's great that they have them in here. But this leads into the discussion section, which starts on page 303. So I do actually recommend reading through that particular section. The reflections on the research questions were interesting, but then they also have some implications for CS educators. So for example, for teachers, this is from page 303 and 304, quote, "We recommend that teachers should consider their students' prior programming language knowledge and design classroom activities that engage their initial understanding to help them evolve their conceptual knowledge as they learn new programming languages. Furthermore, teachers should use explicit instruction to help their students correct negative syntax and semantic transfer from prior languages. Lastly, teachers should be strongly encouraged to add to their reasons for teaching multiple languages the benefit of deepening conceptual understanding about programming language concepts." End quote. Yeah, I like all of those suggestions. I also like their suggestions for researchers and for curriculum designers. So for example, for researchers, they suggest, quote, "If transfer strategies are to be used effectively by computing teachers, a carefully planned pedagogy is required. Therefore, this presents an opportunity for researchers to work with experienced teachers to develop, implement, and evaluate a pedagogy where transfer interventions tackle specific student transfer problems, examples, concepts, syntax, and semantics, presented in this study and transfer research," end quote. That is a really important quote. There are some CS education researchers out there who have never taught a day in their life in K-12 context, so it really makes sense to work with teachers who have a background in education and pedagogies, etc. So highly recommend that. Research practitioner partnerships are an excellent way to do that. If you're unfamiliar with it, there's a lot of RFPs that encourage that approach, like through NSF and whatnot. And then finally, the section on curriculum designers, they mentioned that it might be helpful to guide this transfer of understanding by creating some resources that specifically transfer from one language or platform to another. I'd argue it depends on how you design your resources. You might not need that. It might not need to be explicit, but you could do like a translation document, video, or experience, or series of projects that kind of helps guide that transfer from one project or platform to another, but it just kind of depends on what you're doing and how complicated it is. All right, so that's a summary of the paper itself, but at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to provide some lingering questions and thoughts that I have while reading through it. This is not meant as a critique of the authors or anything. I enjoyed this paper, and I'm fascinated by some of the findings. But one of the questions that I have is, what's the level of transfer when teaching to concept versus label or skill? So as mentioned throughout, multiple teachers mentioned focusing on concepts over practices. In music education, which is what my background is in, we'd often refer to concept over label. So for example, we might say amplitude or volume or gain or dynamic to indicate how loud or soft something is. But those are all labels for the concept that things can be loud, soft, or anywhere in between. As another example, we would often have musicians transfer from one instrument or device to another instrument or device for making music. And to be honest, the transfer wasn't a big concern among music educators in terms of like the negative effects of, oh, well, if they learn saxophone fingering and then they transfer over to clarinet, they're not going to sound as good. Well, yeah, they're learning a completely different instrument. It's assumed that you're going to need to practice it. So if you go from a saxophone to a clarinet, you're going to have to relearn some things, and it's assumed, yeah, it's going to take some time to retrain your muscle memory. And if you jump back and forth between the different instruments, your brain might mix them up sometimes. That happened to me when I was teaching those instruments. That's to be expected. It's not like oh, wow, I'm so surprised. You went from playing marimba to playing vibraphone and it doesn't sound as good. Well, yeah, that's because it's different techniques, different setups, different contexts, different styles, or syntax, if you will, etc. For whatever reason, computer science educators seem to get hung up on, oh, well, when you transfer from one language to another, it's not one-to-one. And I don't know why that would ever be expected, in my opinion. Like, I went from using a video editing software to a different one, and the concepts are all the same, but they have different features, they have different ways of doing things, and they sometimes use different labels for the same concept, like rendering versus exporting versus bouncing, etc. All of those basically mean, hey, I want to take this project and turn it into a video that I want to share. But you have to learn the different labels, basically the different syntax, the different ways of engaging with that platform. And it's the same thing for a programming language. But to argue with myself, it's not just conceptual, it's also skill-based. So here's an example that's very specific to my nerdiness. If you go to my website, you'll notice that I have computer science content, but I also have drumming content and then gaming content. If you've watched any of the videos of gaming, you'll know that I have gone from years of playing controller on a game like Fortnite. And then I switched over to keyboard and mouse. And even though I understand all of the same concepts, it's the same game, I know I'm supposed to aim, I know how to interact with things, I know I'm supposed to build, it's a completely different set of mechanics, different fingers, different motions, etc. And it really messed me up. Even though conceptually I get it, my brain's like, wait, what's the button for this thing? Same thing for syntax in a programming language. If you're not used to adding in curly braces or semicolons, and you're instead used to indentation and not needing semicolons, you're gonna have to basically develop the skill or the habit of putting in curly braces and semicolons and other syntax variations, etc. So yeah, there's a conceptual thing that we need to focus on, but we also need to focus on just the habits and understand that mistakes will happen. It's like learning when you transfer from one language to another. And that's, quite frankly, okay. We don't want to just learn the concepts. We want to apply those understandings through a program or a project or something that we create and can do with those concepts. Otherwise, what's the point of learning it? You're not going to use it in some way. But I'm also curious about okay, well, how does the transfer from and between higher or lower languages impact understanding? So my own guess is that it is easier to transfer from a lower level language to a higher level language than the other way around. So if you're not familiar with the terminology, lower level language would be something like C++. It's very syntax heavy. There's a lot of things you need to worry about in terms of basically the grammar of your code in order to make sure that things work. It's lower in that it more resembles machine code. If you transfer from that to a higher level language, which is syntax light, it looks more like writing out sentences than it does like code. My guess is that would be easier because you're going, oh, I don't need all that extra stuff. But if you go the other way around, and you go from something that's light on syntax to something that is heavier on syntax, my guess is you would forget things, and it would be an inconvenience and a frustration rather than the other way around, where it's like, oh, this is so much easier. However, it is a lot easier to start with a higher level language that is syntax light than something that is a lower level language. So it's kind of like a catch there, where it's like, do I want to make it easier for the transfer or easier to begin? And I don't really have a good answer for that. And that kind of transfers into the next question that I have. So what's the line between motivation to learn and effectiveness of an approach used to transfer understandings? So for example, instructional designers often talk about minimizing cognitive load to make it so that it's the most efficient way to learn something. But often in instructional design approaches, it assumes an inherent and equal motivation among the participants. And it doesn't really talk about how some students are there to learn and others don't care, especially if they're required to be there. So in my opinion, it really matters who is initiating this transfer of language, as it can have a profound impact on whether or not somebody's willing to make the transfer. As some of the teachers mentioned, some students just want to stick with their original language. Like if I had a kid who is like really into video gaming and I'm like, all right, class, we're going to start learning Sonic Pi, they're probably going to put up some resistance and go, I want to stick with Scratch and just make video games. I don't want to code music, which is the only thing you can do in Sonic Pi. So when transferring from one language to another, I left it up to students to make that decision. This was much more difficult to teach because if there are 30 students in the class, they'd be working on 30 different projects in several different languages simultaneously. So again, I had to quickly shift from one language to the next when I would be walking by and assessing their code and look for potential problems or bugs, or when I'd be providing some questions for them to think through to try and help guide them towards some kind of an understanding or to solving a problem, etc. It also made it harder in terms of not being able to find as many peers. If there are 30 kids in the class all working on the same language, it's a whole lot easier to say, hey, talk to the person next to you, see if they can help out. But if the people on either side of you are working on a completely different language or different platform, that makes that conversation a little bit harder. So as much as I love the motivation side of things and really focusing on that to determine whether you can transfer, there is this like fine line between when should you and when should you not do the transfer. And really it's up to you and the kids that you're working with, in my opinion. Can't give a blanket statement of this is when you absolutely should or should not do it. But that's my own epistemology. All right, so the next question that I have is how might we help students, teachers, and scholars prepare for making the connections between different languages? So if there's a point where students, teachers, whatever, are going to learn another language, how can we make that easier? I honestly don't understand when people are surprised students have to relearn something in a new context, because I made mistakes all the time when I was learning a new language. I would frequently mix up my syntaxes when I'm learning a new language or languages. That's just to be expected. But this leads to the next question that I have is how and when might we teach multiple languages within the same class? Rather than assuming that everybody needs to be doing the same thing at the same time, when might we have multiple ways of engaging in computer science within the same shared space. The way I did it was not all of a sudden jumping into several languages going on at once. I, first of all, had to learn them. So I made a goal for myself to add in at least one language each semester, one new option. Because kids were required to be in these K-8 classes, I wanted them to have options for how they could express themselves through code, rather than just having everybody doing the same thing and assuming, oh, well, everyone's going to be interested in making video games. Maybe, probably not. That made it a whole lot easier for me, but I also had a wife who was going to school full-time, did not have kids, had older dogs who required low amounts of maintenance, etc. So I had the time on weeknights, on weekends, so-called vacations, where I was learning new languages that I could then apply into the classroom. That's a lot harder to do when you have other things to focus on outside of school. So while I think it wasn't ideal for the students, it was not necessarily ideal for my time and what I was getting paid for. But that was a sacrifice I was willing to make, and is not a sacrifice that I expect others to make. All right, I've got a lot of questions for this particular one, but here's the very last one. So what transfer strategies might we learn from other domains? So as I mentioned, it's assumed that there's going to be some negative impacts of transferring from one instrument to another. So music educators have to figure out how to help those students. But that's just one domain that does this regularly. What about like sports psychologists and kinesiologists? How do they help athletes transfer from one movement or motion or entire sport to another? And what about other domains that talk about transfer of understandings and whatnot? What can we learn from them? I really hope that there are CS Ed scholars out there that hear this and go, oh yeah, my child's involved in X activity, or I was previously involved in Y activity, and there is transfer of understanding. I wonder if there's scholarship on that transfer of understanding. I bet you there is. And I bet you the field of CS education could learn a lot from checking out research from other domains. For example, check out K. Anders Ericsson's work on developing skills and expertise, which I did a podcast on one of his papers, and I'll include a link to that episode in the show notes. But I've rambled on for far too long. I really enjoyed this particular paper. I hope you check it out. It's linked to in the show notes. And if you want to see myself learn some new skills and understandings related to gaming and drumming, feel free to check that out on my website. But more importantly, check out all the CS education resources at jaredoleary.com and the free computer science education resources that I create at bootupPD.org. Stay tuned next week for another episode. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.